Welcome to Pivot to Profit, where personal growth meets business strategy, and I am your host, TaVia Woolley. This is episode 3 in an ongoing series, and I want to take a moment to connect the thread before we get into today's content. In episode 1, we talked about the books that built my thinking, specifically how studying the right material rewires how you make decisions. In episode 2, we talked about environment and how the spaces you inhabit every day are either growing you or quietly holding you back. Today, we go wider. Because you can have the right books in the right environment and still have a ceiling on your vision. And that ceiling is often the result of a limited exposure. When you haven't seen something, it is difficult to imagine it for yourself. That's the problem this episode is designed to solve. One of the most profitable things I do consistently has nothing to do with a marketing strategy, a sales funnel, or a new offer. Whenever I travel, I go shopping. I just don't go shopping for clothes. I shop for goals. By the end of this episode, I want to show you how I use travel and new experiences to intentionally expand my vision, challenge my thinking, and create bigger possibilities for my business and my life. And I'm going to introduce you to something I'll call the $1 million hour. The moment most people waste after an experience that is actually where strategy is born. So let's jump in. Why exposure is a strategy. When I travel, whether it's somewhere new or a place I've been before, I arrive with a different mindset than most people carry into a trip. I'm observing everything: the architecture, the atmosphere, the businesses, how people interact, the work culture, the languages, the way people invest their time and their money. Everything becomes data. One practice I've developed: I rarely tell many people where I'm going before a trip. Not because I'm secretive, but because I've learned that unsolicited opinions and other people's assumptions about a place can shape your expectations before you even arrive. I want to experience it with fresh eyes and an open mind. That commitment to fresh eyes is strategic because the whole point of exposure is to let something new in. You can't do that if you've already decided what you're going to see. Growing up, I had very little exposure to what was possible. The world I knew was small, not because it was all that existed, but because it was all I had seen. And what you haven't seen, you struggle to imagine for yourself. Exposure is an antidote to that. Every new place expands what feels possible. Every conversation stretches your thinking. Every experience adds a new layer to your mental blueprint of what life can look like. That is why I call it shopping for goals. I'm not collecting souvenirs. I'm collecting possibilities. So let me tell you about the conversation that changed everything. A few years ago, I attended the John Maxwell Leadership Conference, and one of the most significant moments of the trip had nothing to do with the stage. During a break, I fell into a conversation with a man who owned a construction management business, completely different from my world, and that's exactly why I was drawn to it. As we talked, he shared how his business had evolved over the years. In structure, in systems, in value, he wasn't talking about marketing or clients. He was talking about building something that could outlast him, something that could eventually be sold. And in that moment, something in my thinking shifted permanently. I was thinking like someone running a business, not someone building something with long-term transferable value. That one conversation changed the questions I started asking. What is my business worth? How do I build something that works without me? What does long-term value actually look like? Because sometimes we believe wealth comes from working harder, but in many cases, wealth comes from building something that can eventually be transferred, sold, or scaled beyond you. That wasn't just a conversation, that was exposure, and exposure changes expectations. So lesson 1, travel with intention. Travel, whether across the world or just to a part of the city that you've never explored, is only as valuable as the intention you bring to it. Before every trip, I set one clear intention. I'm going to meet interesting people. I often travel alone. People sometimes comment that it seems brave. It's not brave. It's strategic. When you're alone, you're more open, more present, more approachable. You're not managing someone else's energy or timeline. You're fully available for what the experience has to offer, and that availability is where opportunity lives. Conversations are often a doorway to ideas you didn't know existed, but you have to be present enough to walk through that door. Lesson learned. The ROI of any experience is determined before you arrive. Intention is the filter through which exposure becomes insight. Without it, you're just a tourist. With it, you're a student of possibility. So here are some action steps. Before your next trip or outing, whether it's a conference, a new city, or neighborhood you've never visited, write down one clear intention. What are you going there to find, learn, or experience. Practice solo presence. If you've always traveled with a group, consider one outing this month where you go alone. Notice the difference in how available you are to what's around you. After any intentional outing, write down 3 things you observed that you wouldn't have noticed before. Observation is a skill, so practice it. Lesson number 2. Make yourself approachable. Now, if you're introverted or you find yourself in environments where you don't know anyone, here's a simple strategy that works for me consistently. I wear what I call a wow statement piece. Sometimes it's bold earrings, sometimes it's an outfit, sometimes it's simply an accessory, but it's always intentional. People naturally comment on what stands out. I love your earrings. That bag is beautiful. Where did you get that jacket? Boom. The conversation starts. And now I get to introduce myself. I make sure my introduction is memorable, not to impress people, but because I understand that opportunity often starts with a conversation you didn't plan for. And the opening for that conversation sometimes has to be created deliberately. This principle, by the way, extends far beyond networking. It's about showing up with intention in how you present yourself, which is something we go deeper on later in this series. So lesson learned. Approachability is a skill and it can be designed. You do not have to wait for connection to happen organically. You can create the conditions that make it more likely. So here are some action steps. Identify your wow statement piece, the thing that you wear that consistently draws a comment or starts a conversation. If you don't have one, that's a gap worth addressing. Practice your introduction, not a rehearsed pitch, a genuine, memorable 2 or 3 sentences about who you are and what you do. Say it out loud until it feels natural. At your next event or outing, commit to starting at least just one conversation with someone you don't know. Not to network, to be genuinely curious. So lesson number 3, the $1 million hour. This is the concept I want you to walk away from this episode with, because this one changes everything. The $1 million hour is the 1 hour after an experience that most people completely waste. They scroll, they rush to the next thing, they mentally check out before the experience has fully landed. I do the opposite. When I travel, I build in intentional time before I leave a city. Sometimes it's at the airport early. I find a window, sit down with an espresso martini, and I write. I actually have a growing collection of espresso martini photos from airports and restaurants around the country. It's become part of my ritual. But the drink isn't the point. The ritual is. In that hour, I ask myself, what did I just experience? What stood out? What surprised me? And what new ideas surfaced? And what goal just changed? I pour everything onto paper and then I begin connecting ideas. One thought leads to another. One question opens another question. Eventually, I have pages of possibilities. Most people come home with souvenirs. I come home with a strategy. Because the $1 million hour is where experience becomes direction, where exposure becomes clarity, where ideas stop being thoughts and start becoming action. Lesson learned. The value of an experience is not in having it, it's in extracting from it. Without intentional reflection, even the most powerful experience fades into a memory rather than becoming a catalyst for change. So here are some action steps. Design your own version of the $1 million hour. It doesn't have to be an espresso martini at an airport, but it needs to be a consistent ritual, a specific time, a specific tool for capturing thoughts, a specific set of questions you return to after every significant experience. Use these 5 questions as your starting point. What did I just experience? What stood out? What surprised me the most? What new ideas surfaced and what goal just changed? Keep a dedicated notebook or voice memo folder for these reflections. When you review them quarterly, the patterns will tell you something important about where you're being called to go. Lesson 4. Rest is part of the strategy. The $1 million hour only works if you created enough stillness to hear yourself think. And that brings us to something I believe deeply and haven't always practiced well. Rest is not separate from growth. Rest is part of growth. One of the most transformational seasons of my life began after my mother passed away in March of 2024. My instinct, the instinct most of us have, was to stay busy, to push through, to produce. My response instead was to rest. For about 7 months, I intentionally slowed down, and during that time, I read 2 books that reshaped how I think about productivity entirely. Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey, and Rest by Alex Sujong Kim Pang. One idea from Hersey stayed with me. Rest reminds us that we are human beings, not human doings or machines. And from Pang, deliberate rest is a necessity if you want to do your best work. We're taught that profit comes from doing more, but I've learned something different. Profit often comes from thinking better, and you cannot think better when you are depleted. Rest is where clarity returns, where ideals settle, where you begin to see clearly again. Lessons learned. Slowing down is not falling behind. For high-capacity people who are used to producing at a high level, rest is often the most countercultural and most necessary investment you can make in yourself. You cannot access your best thinking from a depleted state. So here are some action steps. Audit where you are currently running on empty. Not in a dramatic sense, practically. Where are you producing from depletion rather than capacity? Identify one form of rest that restores you, and I mean genuinely restores you, and schedule it this week, not someday. Yes, this week. Read or listen to Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey. It will challenge the hustle narrative in ways that are both grounding and freeing. Lesson number 5. Share wisely. Whenever I travel or have a significant experience, I share it with one trusted person. You heard me, just one. Here's why. Sharing reinforces learning. It helps you process and articulate what you've experienced. The act of putting it into words for someone else deepens your own understanding of it. But too many voices at the wrong moment dilutes your clarity. Not everyone can hold your vision while it's still forming. Not everyone has the capacity to ask the questions that help you go deeper, rather than the questions that make you doubt. Protect your excitement while it's still becoming direction. Share with one person who listens, who asks expanding questions, and who won't project their own limitations onto your vision. Lesson learned. New vision is vulnerable. It needs to be protected in its early stages. Sharing too widely before an idea has solidified is one of the fastest ways to let someone else's ceiling become yours. So here are some action steps. Identify your one trusted person, the person in your life who consistently asks expanding questions rather than a limiting one. That is your vision sharing partner. Practice holding ideas for 48 hours before sharing them broadly. Notice what happens to the idea when you sit with it before exposing it to external opinion. If you don't currently have that person in your life, that gap is worth addressing. Consider a coach, a mentor, or a peer who operates at or above your level. Lesson 6. Don't collect inspiration, implement it. This may be the most important lesson in the entire episode. Some people collect passport stamps, some collect business cards, some collect motivational quotes and vision board images. I collect ideas. But ideas don't change your life, implementation does. When I return from any significant experience, I identify the one idea that had the most impact on me. Then I ask, what goal needs to change because of this? What system needs to be updated? What content should I create? What process should I improve? How do I integrate this into my actual daily life, not my someday list? Inspiration without implementation is just entertainment. Don't become someone who collects it. Become someone who acts on it. Lesson learned. The gap between inspired and transformed is action. Every idea you collect and don't implement becomes clutter in your mental space. One implemented idea is worth more than 100 admired ones. Here's some action steps. After your next significant experience, identify the single most impactful idea. Write it down. Assign it one specific action and a deadline within 7 days. Create an implementation tracker, a simple document or note where you record the ideas and the specific action steps tied to them. Review it monthly. Audit your current idea backlog. What have you been inspired by in the last 6 months that you haven't acted on? What would it take to close the gap on just one of them? Lesson 7. Become a student again. Whenever I discover a new idea worth pursuing, I run it through 4 questions. What did I learn? What changed in my thinking? What action am I taking this week? When will I review it? And then I become a student. I find the books, the podcasts, the experts, the communities. I immerse myself in learning until I understand enough to begin applying it with confidence. Because growth requires curiosity, and curiosity requires humility. The moment you decide you already know enough is the moment you stop growing. And in business, standing still is the same as falling behind. Never stop being a student. Lessons learned. Expertise is not the enemy of learning. Arrogance is. The most effective leaders and builders I know are consistently the most curious people in the room. They are perpetual students, not because they lack knowledge. Understand that knowledge compounds. So here are some action steps. Apply the 4-question framework to one current goal or idea this week. Write down your answers, then identify one resource, a book, a podcast, an expert, that will deepen your understanding of it. Find one community, online or in person, that is operating at or above the level that you're currently at. Proximity to people who are further along accelerates your growth more than almost anything else does. Set a recurring monthly review. What have I been learning? What have I implemented? Where is curiosity pulling me next? This week's pivot challenge. Identify your next trip or intentional outing, and I want you to be clear. This does not have to involve a plane ticket. Maybe it's a conference in your city, a neighborhood you've never explored, a museum you've driven past 100 times, a cultural event outside your usual experiences. Wherever you go, do 4 things. Start one meaningful conversation with someone you don't know. Observe something that genuinely challenges your current perspective. Write down 5 ideas that open new possibilities. Choose one idea and implement something concrete from it within 7 days of returning. The goal is not simply to go somewhere. The goal is to return different than when you left. Here are some reflection questions. What have I seen recently that I would have overlooked before? What conversations in the last month shifted my thinking? And did I act on them? Where in my life am I collecting inspiration instead of implementing it? What version of myself am I meeting when I step outside of my usual environment? As I always like to say, action creates momentum. Momentum builds confidence, and confidence changes how you show up in your business and your life. Remember, every place you visit has the potential to introduce you to a version of yourself you've never met before. Don't just collect memories, collect possibilities. Then come home and build them. In the next episode, we go into the work that happens behind the scenes, the costly mistakes that taught me more about business, people, and protecting my gift than anything else I've experienced. You'll want to be ready for that one. Until next time, keep pivoting with purpose. Y'all be easy.